When they were launched, electric vehicles were touted as the future of the automotive industry. Everyone and their best friend was trying to get an EV, since it seemed like gas prices would only continue to rise and people would do anything to not have to fuel their cars. The interesting thing is that this whole trend continued for a very long time. EV manufacturers continued to hype the fact that their cars essentially provided a way for people to no longer use gasoline to power vehicles, and the messaging stuck for a while. But if the past few years have shown anything, it's that even the promise of no longer relying on gasoline hasn't been enough to make EVs the new standard in the automotive space. And now, things appear set to get worse for the EV industry, as a set of new policies and laws is about to completely switch things. So what happened? How is the EV industry about to change for the worse? Will EVs even be a viable option for consumers anymore? Let's find out everything we need to know in this video. Whenever you think about EVs, the first company that crosses your mind is probably Tesla. The company has been the vocal leader in the EV space, championing its fleet of cars and pushing them as not just vehicles, but tech revolutionaries. And in a market where tech stocks were all the rage, Tesla enjoyed the hype, eventually becoming the most valuable auto manufacturer in the world by market capitalization. But those days are all gone. Tesla's stock has since plummeted, causing the company to lose a staggering $753 billion in market capitalization. In fact, literally, as this video was being prepared, Tesla's stock has crashed to a 12-month low. Interestingly, this is happening at a period when tech stocks are all notching highs. Google is at an all-time high, Microsoft is at an all-time high, Amazon is at an all-time high, and Nvidia? Well, let's just say that it would take something truly monumental to get that company off its momentum at this point. Considering that Tesla has always marketed itself and been seen as a tech company and not necessarily an auto manufacturer, you can imagine that this would be strange. It's not just Tesla's stock price that's cratered. The company's fundamentals have also dropped, with quarterly revenues hitting their lowest point since the end of 2022. Gross profit has also dropped by 23%, while operating income has also been slashed in half. We should point out that net income has been on the rise, but even that isn't because Tesla's business is doing necessarily well. Instead, it's because the company managed to get a one-time tax credit of $5.9 billion. When you take that figure out of its income, you definitely see a much different picture. Now, about that tax credit, you might want to keep it in mind for later. To make things worse for Tesla, delivery growth has also not been so great. The company has seen its deliveries drop steadily since 2020, and it has even said that there is a high chance that vehicle deliveries will be significantly lower in 2024 than they were last year. All of this is despite constant price cuts and tax credits, all of which have made its Model 3 as cheap as $23,000 in states like California. When you think about it, the realization that Tesla is a vehicle manufacturer and not a tech company is starting to set in. And with the company still about $200 billion more valuable than its next competitor, Toyota, despite delivering just about a fifth of what Toyota is delivering, you can imagine how much downside there still is for the stock. Now, away from Tesla, the entire EV industry is honestly not doing great. In fact, they're doing even worse than Tesla. Lucid, Rivian, NIO, and other EV stocks are easily down over 90% from their peaks, and it's looking like many of them are really just trying to avoid bankruptcy at this point. At the same time, even legacy automakers are now having trouble justifying their switch to EVs. For instance, Ford has halted shipping of its F-150 Lightning EV, citing a very slow level of demand. The company was reported to be losing about $36,000 per vehicle delivered, which is only chump change compared to Lucid's massive $227,000 loss per car. With all of this, it's pretty clear that the EV bubble has popped massively. And if some analysts are to be believed, we might not even have found the bottom yet. So what exactly is the reason for this? How did this once promising market get here? To really understand what happened to this industry, we need to get back to the peak of the hype surrounding them. In late 2021, companies like Tesla and Rivian were at the top of the world. Rivian, which boasted a market valuation of about $150 billion, was America's largest company with no revenues and even had a valuation larger than Volkswagen. People were literally waiting up to 6 months for Tesla deliveries and were even paying record prices. The lowest-priced Tesla, the Model 3, cost $47,000 and had a wait time of 2 months. For the Model X Plaid, you'd have to pay $139,000 and wait for between 3 to 4 months. At the same time, Rivian also raised prices as it looked to capitalize on the rising demand. Well, fast forward to March of 2022, and everything changed. In a bid to control inflation, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates from 0%. Up until this point, companies like Tesla had been offering 0% interest rates to their customers, which made their cars way too affordable. Even after the Fed began raising interest rates, these hikes didn't really affect the EV industry, but the hikes soon caught up, and boy, it wasn't pretty. At the moment, Tesla charges 6.5% interest to customers with good credit. If you have only fair credit, that number rises to 11%. These mean that the same cars suddenly cost about 20% to 30% more because much of that payment is actually just going to interest. Obviously, no one would want to do that. The only way for EV makers to survive this was by slashing prices continually and without pause. And they did. Tesla's Model 3 dropped from $47,000 to $39,000, while the Model Y dropped from $63,000 to $44,000. Higher-end models like the Model S and X also saw significant drops, showing that Tesla was basically fighting tooth and nail to keep its prices low. And so were the other EV manufacturers. Now, as you would imagine, cuts like these significantly affected the gross margins of EV makers. Tesla saw its margins drop from 27% to 18%, meaning a significant drop in profitability too. The good news is that Tesla was mature and liquid enough to weather the storm. The bad news, however, is that many other EV makers just weren't. Take Lucid, for example. It launched its Air vehicle in 2022, pegging it at $140,000. The company eventually raised the car's price again to $155,000. Today, the Lucid Air costs just $70,000. So you see why the company loses over $200,000 per vehicle delivered. You would think that the drop in EV prices would make them more attractive. After all, something cheaper is always the better option, right? Well, no. And that brings us to the next problem: dropping demand. For a long time, EVs have been described as the future of EVs. And when you look at a lot of government policies, you'd see that there's an apparent desire for them to be. But it kind of looks more like that future might not necessarily come soon enough. For most EV enthusiasts, the major bottleneck to adoption has been price. But interestingly enough, it does seem like EVs are now priced appropriately. Sure, they're not as cheap as used cars, but if you were going to get a new vehicle, then you'd arguably be better off with an EV. They're cheaper, and you also don't have to pay so much for gas and maintenance. Still, with all these benefits, EVs only control about 6.5% of the vehicle market, and to make it worse, sales are still slowing. All of these really just go to show that the average consumer, for some reason, does not see EVs as a solid play. While cost has always been seen as the major factor for EVs, it would appear that consumers have other concerns, such as charging and range. Most EVs today claim to have a range of 300 to 400 miles on a single charge. But when you turn on the heating and it's cold outside, your range will get crushed. Add this to the fact that charging stations aren't so abundant, and you kind of see why a lot of consumers are skeptical. I mean, if you usually move around a short distance every day and you have a charging station at home, you probably won't have a headache here. But for most consumers who want to take long trips, or maybe even the occasional mistake of forgetting to charge, owning an EV might not necessarily be such a practical choice. And we've not even spoken about possible maintenance. Last year, there was a trending story about a guy who apparently got a small dent on his Rivian truck. Small fix, right? Well, wrong. This guy literally had to spend a staggering $22,000 on repairs, and even at that, he had to wait a full 2 months before he could get his car back. As it turns out, a lot of repair shops don't still have the infrastructure or technical knowledge to work with EVs. And as you can imagine, this only adds to the fact that these cars are really just impractical. It's the major reason why most people who own EVs still keep around gasoline cars as well. Sure, EVs are great for the environment, but from a practical standpoint, owning a gasoline car is usually the better choice. At the end of the day, EV makers are tasked with delivering vehicles that can offer a more reliable experience while still being appropriately priced. And as we all know, this is a very uphill battle. To add a final nail in the coffin, we also need to consider the fact that 2024 is an election year. And as the two major parties already have their consensus candidates, it appears that EVs have now become a major hot-button issue. If you recall, one of the many reasons why President Biden actually won in 2020 was that he promised to usher in significant change in the auto industry. And in more ways than one, he has. The Biden administration has provided more credits to EV manufacturers while also enacting policies that would help to improve the rate of production and adoption that these cars have. But times have changed, and it looks more like we could be heading for a new dawn. Republican frontrunner and former President Donald Trump has been gaining significant momentum in the polls, and if there's one thing that he has made clear, it's that he isn't necessarily a fan of EVs at all. While he was in power, Trump didn't exactly do much to improve the standing of EVs in the automotive industry. And now that he's back, the former president's messaging is simple. EVs are bad for the middle class, mostly because they are both super expensive and not that practical. Trump has also slammed most EV manufacturers, as well as traditional legacy car makers who have pivoted to EVs. In his words, many of these companies are either foolish or gutless, as they've been pushing the environmentalist agenda that includes EVs on consumers for years now. At the same time, one of Trump's major gripes appears to be the fact that a surge in EV adoption could significantly affect over half of all auto jobs in the United States. And with employment now being a major issue in the United States, Trump isn't letting up when he says that he'll be coming for the EV industry if he ends up getting into the White House. Trump's rhetoric is also hitting at the long-standing rivalry between the United States and China. According to the former president, China has a big piece of the pie when it comes to the minerals being used to manufacture EVs. And because of that, a lot of EV makers appear to now be playing into China's hands, increasing their reliance on these minerals and only bolstering China's economy. Essentially, the former president is slamming President Biden for enabling China at the expense of the United States, and more importantly, American jobs. All through the campaign trail, especially in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, where automotive manufacturing is a huge deal, Trump has kept on hammering these talking points. And if you know anything about him, it's that Trump definitely has a way of scaring people into doing what he wants. With the former president now gaining more momentum in the polls, there is a huge sense that he could be coming hard for the EV industry if he manages to get elected again in November. This would mean putting an end to the tax credits that companies like Tesla enjoy, and maybe even placing higher tariffs or restrictions on the minerals that EV makers import from China. Then, Trump could essentially impose new laws that would stifle EV production and essentially make it a more difficult landscape for EV manufacturers to operate. So if you thought that the EV market is difficult now, imagine how bad things would get in a second Trump government. As things stand, the EV market is in a state of flux. With low production and even lower demand, manufacturers have to be innovative if they want to increase their profit margins and prevent their stocks from falling even more. And with the prospect of a regime change coming, there really is no telling what is in store for these companies.